I remember the silence more than the noise. Not the silence of an empty stadium before the gates open, but the silence that settles after the last echo of the crowd fades. That moment when the game is finished, the outcome decided, and something intangible lingers in the air. For decades, that silence meant rest. It meant waiting. It meant knowing that the next game would come the same way the last one did. Same place, same ritual. Same sense of belonging. That certainty is gone now. What remains is a different kind of quiet. Uneasy, unresolved. The kind of silence that follows a change no one announced out loud, but everyone feels in their bones. Football is still played. The league still thrives. The stadiums still fill. But something fundamental has shifted, and it did not happen on the field. This story begins at the end of an era, not with a whistle or an injury, but with a realization. The realization that we are living through the final season of something that once felt permanent. Not the final season of a team or a dynasty or a legendary player. The final season of a shared experience. The final season of football as an inevitability. There was a time when the game did not need to be chased. It arrived. It belonged. You did not plan access to football. You assumed it. Sundays were not scheduled around options. They were built around certainty. The game was there, and everyone knew where to find it. That certainty shaped everything. It shaped families. It shaped neighborhoods. It shaped entire cities that moved in unison, bound by kickoff times and final scores. Loyalty was not something you proved. It was something you inherited. You did not choose it. You grew into it. I grew up believing football would always work that way, not because anyone told me, but because it always had. It felt larger than decisions, larger than contracts, larger than strategy. It felt like a public good masquerading as entertainment. Something that existed for everyone, regardless of age, income, or circumstance. That belief did not disappear all at once. It eroded quietly. At first, nothing felt wrong. The games were still there. The voices were still familiar. The rhythm remained intact. But then came the moments of confusion. The moment you sat down out of habit and realized the game was not where it had always been. No explanation that mattered. No acknowledgement that something had been taken away. Just absence. Absence changes behavior. At first, you adjust, you adapt. You tell yourself it is temporary, that this is just how things evolve, that the inconvenience is minor compared to the privilege of still watching the game you love. But adaptation is not the same as acceptance, and repetition has a way of exposing the truth beneath the surface. Football used to meet the fan halfway. That was the unspoken agreement. You gave it your time, your emotion, your loyalty, and it gave you access. That balance no longer exists. Now the responsibility has shifted. The fan must pursue the game, must navigate, must comply, must remain flexible. And flexibility sounds harmless until it becomes a requirement. I did not notice when watching football stopped being a habit and became a choice. But I felt it. Choice introduces friction. Friction weakens ritual. Ritual is how loyalty survives. Habit asks nothing. Choice asks everything. When football was a habit, it anchored the weak. It created a rhythm that life moved around. When football becomes a choice, it competes with everything else. Work, family, fatigue, distraction, 1,000 alternatives waiting for attention. The league calls this progress. It measures success in reach and scale and expansion. But progress does not always preserve what it replaces. Sometimes it consumes it. The disappearance of universal access did not come with a warning label. There was no announcement that this was the direction things were heading. There was no moment where fans were asked if they were willing to trade simplicity for abundance, ritual for flexibility, belonging for access. It just happened, slow enough to avoid revolt, fast enough to avoid reversal. And in that space between adaptation and resistance, something else slipped away. The feeling that football was inevitable. The feeling that it would always be there in the same way it always had been. I began to hear it in the way people talked about the game. Less certainty, more questions. Where is it on? Do you have access? Are you watching? The language changed before the behavior did. Language always tells the truth first. When loyalty depends on access, loyalty becomes conditional. Conditions change. People change. Habits break. That is the danger no one wants to say out loud. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is subtle. Football will not vanish. It will not collapse under the weight of its own success. It will continue to dominate headlines and revenue charts. But dominance does not guarantee devotion. Devotion is fragile. It is built slowly and lost quietly. I think about the fans who did not adapt, not out of protest, but out of exhaustion. Those who did not chase the game into its new forms, who missed 1 week, then another, until the absence became normal. They did not announce their departure. They simply stopped showing up. Their silence is not measured. This is not nostalgia. It is recognition. Recognition that something once communal is becoming conditional. That something once assumed is now negotiated. That football, for all its power, is no longer immune to the consequences of choice. The shift we are living through is not about screens or platforms or convenience. It is about control, about who decides how loyalty is earned and maintained, about whether the game still belongs to the people who built it with their attention, their time, and their lives. Power is changing hands, quietly, not from players to owners or teams to the league, but from the audience to the system that manages access to them. And once power shifts, it rarely returns unchanged. I remember the first time I truly understood the power of football beyond the field. It was not about a touchdown, a tackle, or a miraculous play. It was about presence, about participation, about a shared ritual that spanned cities, time zones, and generations. For decades, Sunday afternoons were synchronized to the pulse of the National Football League. The league did not simply entertain. It commanded attention, shaped calendars, and structured life itself. Watching football was not optional. It was inevitable. The certainty of it gave it power. It gave fans identity. It gave culture. This documentary is not about X's and O's. It is not about wins, losses, or championships. It is about the invisible game being played off the field. The game of control, of money, of loyalty. The game that determines who gets to watch, when, and how. It is about how the very institution that built communal identity has, in pursuit of growth, risked fragmenting the very audience that gave it life. The history of this conflict is rooted in the NFL's earliest rise. Fans still watched habitually, still shared moments collectively, still measured their lives by the rhythm of the game. Football remained omnipresent in the living room, in the office, in the collective imagination. It was an incremental change, manageable and widely accepted. But change does not always announce itself. It accumulates, and eventually, the accumulation becomes inevitable. Streaming changed the dynamic fundamentally. Football became conditional. Fans were no longer guaranteed access. They became consumers, measured not by loyalty or tradition, but by subscriptions, engagement, and retention metrics. Attention had to be earned week by week, game by game, platform by platform. What once was a right had become a privilege. Over the course of this documentary, we will examine these transformations in 15 discrete but connected explorations. The first batch revisits the era when football was universally accessible, highlighting how accessibility shaped cultural identity and loyalty. The second examines the early fractures, the subtle disruptions that went unnoticed by many but signaled deeper instability. The third explores Thursday Night Football as a controlled experiment in exclusivity, revealing the tension between ratings and revenue. The fourth traces the arrival of streaming platforms, their strategies, and their impact on league power dynamics. The sixth batch expands the lens internationally, examining how global ambitions, time zone conflicts, and remote accessibility challenge local loyalty. Fans navigate a labyrinth of subscriptions, platforms, and accounts, sometimes missing the continuity that created community and identity in the first place. The invisible war is not over outcomes on the field. It is over attention, over habit, over what football represents to millions of people. It is about identity, about inheritance, and about the intangible bonds that connect fans to the game and to each other. Over the next 15 segments, we will trace this evolution with precision, examining the consequences, the risks, and the nuances. Each batch builds upon the last, creating a continuous narrative of transformation, conflict, and consequence. This is not a story of speculation. 'Tis a story of documented change, observed behavior, and the realignment of power and culture. We will confront the tension between growth and erosion, between revenue and ritual, between the demands of a global digital economy and the expectations of communities built over decades. This is a story of transformation, but it is also a story of consequence. It asks us to consider what has been lost, what is at stake, and whether the cultural power of football can survive the structural changes that have reshaped it. I remember Sundays the way other people remember holidays. The anticipation began early, almost imperceptibly. With the smell of coffee in the kitchen, the faint hum of radios tuned to pregame shows, the low murmur of neighbors and family members discussing matchups. The game had a presence that was both physical and emotional. It filled the room, the street, the city itself. It did not need to be promised. It simply existed. You did not have to search for it. You did not need instructions or subscriptions. It arrived like clockwork, and its arrival structured everything else. Football in those days was a public institution, a shared experience as much as a sport. It was free in a way that meant more than cost. It was free in access, in expectation, in culture. You could not separate it from the world around you because it was woven into the world around you. Universal access was the foundation of loyalty. There was no question of whether you would watch, only how you would experience it. Families gathered in living rooms where television sets glowed like altars, children clinging to every play as if they were part of it. Fathers explained the rules to sons. Sons debated the statistics with friends. Older generations spoke in the language of history, recalling legendary plays and players from decades past. That language was understood because everyone had access. Everyone had the same reference points. Football was not just a game. It was a lexicon, a shared culture. Access was what allowed loyalty to grow organically. Fans did not need to prove their devotion with money or attention. Devotion was inherited, a natural byproduct of availability and repetition. When everyone could watch, everyone could participate. And participation was what created attachment, what created identity, What created community? The ritual of football extended beyond the television set. Neighborhoods emptied on Sunday afternoons. Schools knew, workplaces slowed. Restaurants timed their lunch rushes to avoid key moments. There were no competing platforms, no subscription walls, no alternative ways to engage that felt equally legitimate. You were either there or you were missing part of the conversation. The game created a rhythm that life followed. It created markers for memory. Birthdays, holidays, family gatherings all existed within the context of football seasons. Generational inheritance was natural because the game was present in the background of every life event. A father's loyalty became a son's default expectation. A mother's weekly routine became a daughter's cultural literacy. This was not just fandom. It was a shared framework for understanding community, for negotiating identity, for measuring time. It was habitual in the purest sense, effortless, and taken for granted. Accessibility mattered more than convenience. There was no choice involved because choice would have diminished the ritual. You did not have to decide to follow the game because it was everywhere you expected it to be. You did not have to buy a service, create an account, or navigate a maze of channels. You only needed to be present. The system was simple, elegant, and comprehensive. It was reliable. Reliability itself became a form of loyalty. When access is guaranteed, when the ritual is predictable, attachment grows. People internalize the game, carrying its narratives and statistics with them through the week. A Monday morning conversation at work could reference a play from the night before, and everyone would understand. This universality was the invisible infrastructure of devotion. Without it, attachment would have required explanation, justification, or persuasion. With it, attachment was inevitable. I think about the stadiums in those years, but more importantly, I think about the living rooms. They were the true arenas of connection. They were where children first learned the drama of the game, where the mythology of teams and players was passed down, and where memory and emotion fused into something lasting. You could leave the house, move to another city, and still maintain connection because the same access existed there. The ritual transcended geography because television guaranteed its presence. Football was a constant, a shared anchor in a world that often felt uncertain. That constancy allowed fans to form bonds not just with teams, but with each other, across neighborhoods, states, and eventually, the country. It was a unifying force, a glue of culture. Universal access also created a level playing field. No fan was privileged over another by circumstance. You did not need wealth, status, or special connections to witness the drama unfold. Everyone experienced the highs and lows together. Upsets became collective shocks. Comebacks became shared triumphs. This equality reinforced the sense that football belonged to everyone, that loyalty was communal rather than transactional. You could love a team, live in a distant city, or have no personal stake and still participate fully. That sense of belonging nurtured habits and deep emotional investment. Fans were loyal because they had every opportunity to be. Loyalty was no longer a choice. It was an inevitable consequence of participation. The rituals themselves reinforced habit. Pre-game shows were not just entertainment. They were primers for conversation, shared knowledge, and anticipation. Halftime was a moment to reflect, to discuss, to theorize. Post-game commentary solidified understanding and debate. These cycles, repeated week after week, created rhythm, structure, and narrative continuity. Each season built upon the last, layering experience and memory. Players became familiar not just for their talent, but for their stories, their consistency, and the public's ability to follow them without interruption. Generational narratives were formed. Names were passed down from parent to child. References understood without explanation. Football became a language, a repository of collective memory. The game was more than what happened on the field. It was an institution that shaped time, identity, and culture. It was in this environment that fandom flourished effortlessly. There was no friction, no barriers, no conditional requirements. Attendance, attention, and engagement were natural byproducts of access and habit. Children grew into fans as part of their environment. Parents did not need to cultivate devotion actively. It happened because access was guaranteed, because ritual was predictable, and because the culture itself celebrated participation. Loyalty was embedded in the very system. It was resilient, organic, and enduring. It did not require marketing campaigns or analytics. It existed because the game existed for everyone, in every home, every neighborhood, every Sunday. This foundation of universal access is what makes the contrast with today so stark. When we look at football now, we see a system fractured by technology, economics, and strategy. We see platforms and subscriptions, choices and paywalls, friction where there was none. The transformation is invisible to some, gradual enough that it feels inevitable, yet profound enough to alter the culture itself. Understanding the power of football when it was free is essential. It shows us what has been lost, what is being replaced, and why loyalty can no longer be assumed. It is not just nostalgia. It is a reference point for everything that follows. In those years, football's ubiquity and accessibility made it more than entertainment. It was a cultural cornerstone. It anchored community, shaped identity, and created lifelong habits. Universal access was the invisible hand that guided devotion. Habit, ritual, and inheritance reinforced each other seamlessly. This is the era we must understand to comprehend what has been sacrificed, what has been disrupted, and what is now conditional. The story of football as a universally accessible game is not just history. It is the lens through which we measure the magnitude of change and the cost of fragmentation. Friends discovered that they were watching different games, or no games at all, because of regional restrictions or network choices. Conversations that once flowed naturally now required explanation. Who had access, who was watching, and where to find the game. The fan was forced to navigate a landscape that was designed to be convenient only if one possessed knowledge, resources, or flexibility. That friction, even when small, disrupted the instinctive participation that had defined generations of viewers. The league underestimated this disruption. Its focus was on revenue, on expanding reach, on testing markets. The cultural contract between football and its audience, the unspoken understanding that access was guaranteed, was largely ignored. Executives measured success in dollars, ratings, and subscriptions, not in the cohesion of experience or the integrity of habit. Decisions were made with financial logic rather than cultural insight. In doing so, they overlooked the fragility of what had been taken for granted, the loyalty that had been built, not through contracts, but through consistency and trust. Some of the earliest exclusive games were intended as experiments. Networks negotiated to showcase prime matchups in isolated packages. certain contests were suddenly must-have content for subscribers, games that could not be accessed without additional cost. For younger fans, and those unfamiliar with the evolving landscape, the rules of access were opaque. The idea that a game could be partially restricted was almost alien to those who had grown up with universal availability. The result was frustration and alienation. People began to experience football as conditional. Its desire alone no longer guaranteed fulfillment. Habit was no longer sufficient. Participation had to be earned through the navigation of platforms and permissions. These fractures, though modest in scale initially, were a harbinger of the erosion to come. The league treated them as minor adjustments rather than foundational changes. But the implications were cultural as much as they were economic. When access is no longer assumed, the shared language of football begins to falter. Anecdotes, references, and communal reactions depend on simultaneity. A conversation about a touchdown or a defensive stop assumes that everyone experienced it. Once games are segmented, the simultaneity that underpins shared memory and collective identity is disrupted. Fans are no longer guaranteed a common framework. The first fractures were subtle, but they marked the beginning of that disruption. I remember hearing stories from fans during this period. Friends and neighbors expressing disbelief at not being able to see their favorite teams without subscribing to multiple services. Families who had grown up with Sunday routines found themselves negotiating access like a bureaucracy. Fans who had spent decades internalizing the narratives of their teams suddenly encountered barriers that required attention, knowledge, and often payment. The reaction was frustration, confusion, and, in some cases, resignation. Some simply stopped watching certain games. Others searched for alternatives. The habitual rhythm, once guaranteed, now required effort and strategy. The league, however, remained focused on expansion. The framing was always positive. Exclusivity increased value, elevated broadcast partnerships, and enhanced the premium nature of marquee matchups. The assumption was that fans would follow, and for a time, they did. Ratings held. Subscriptions grew. The metrics suggested success. Yet what was not measured, and perhaps what could not be measured, was the subtle erosion of shared experience. Habits were disrupted. Conversations fractured. Cultural cohesion weakened. The system rewarded flexibility and access, but punished the instinctive loyalty that had been cultivated over generations. These early exclusive broadcasts were also a test of tolerance. How much inconvenience would fans accept before disengagement began? How many layers could be introduced between desire and fulfillment before frustration replaced habit? For a while, the answer seemed reassuring to the league. Fans adapted, they subscribed. They complained in muted ways, but remained engaged. The danger, though, was in the cumulative effect. One inconvenience alone could be absorbed, but a series of small barriers, applied across multiple games and seasons, slowly changed behavior. Habit gave way to calculation. Participation became conditional. Loyalty became transactional. What the league did not anticipate, or perhaps did not fully consider, was the cultural weight of universality. Football had always been more than a broadcast. It was a ritual. Habit was reinforced by certainty. Children, parents, and grandparents shared reference points because they consumed the same games at the same time. A fractured schedule, with exclusive access, introduced doubt, misalignment, and missed opportunities for collective memory. It created gaps in understanding and experience that would ripple through social networks, workplaces, and neighborhoods. These gaps were small at first, almost invisible, but they represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the sport and its audience. Players and coaches were largely insulated from these changes. The field remained the same, the rules unchanged. The intensity of the game was undiminished. But for the audience, the game was no longer an assured presence. And as the fans shifted from habitual participants to conditional consumers, the psychological landscape of football began to transform. Devotion required effort. Ritual was interrupted. Community cohesion weakened. Loyalty could no longer be assumed. The first fractures taught a lesson that was largely ignored. Access shapes culture as much as the sport itself. When fans are assured of presence, devotion follows organically. When access becomes conditional, devotion becomes conditional. Early exclusive games were small experiments, but they foreshadowed a much larger structural transformation. They were not just about contracts or revenue. They were about how football would be experienced, remembered, and integrated into life. They were the first signs that the invisible social contract between league and fan had begun to erode. Looking back now, it is clear that the first fractures were pivotal. They marked the moment when the implicit assumption that football would always be universally accessible began to break. They demonstrated that the league prioritized control and monetization over cultural cohesion. And they revealed how even modest adjustments to access could ripple through the rituals, habits, and collective memory that had made football more than a game. The cracks were small at first, almost invisible, but they signaled a slow, inexorable transformation that would touch every fan, every season, and every Sunday to come. Thursday Night Football arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the league were testing the water before committing to the full tide. The scheduling of games outside of Sunday, historically sacrosanct and central to the ritual of football fandom, was presented as an innovation, a gift of convenience, a way to expand the reach of the sport. Yet beneath the surface, it was much more than a scheduling adjustment. It was a controlled test of fan tolerance, a probe into the boundaries between habit and disruption, loyalty and obligation. The league wanted to know how far it could push audiences before the fractures of access became visible, measurable, and consequential. Thursday Night Football transformed the rhythm of weekly engagement. What had once been predictable, the start and end of the weekend, punctuated by Sunday games, was now interrupted by a midweek intrusion. Fans were forced to accommodate the league schedule in ways that were previously unnecessary. The ritual, once intuitive and organic, now required deliberate planning. Dinner, family time, work commitments, and social obligations collided with the expectation of midweek attention. For some, it was a welcome addition, a chance to immerse further in the sport they loved. For others, it was the first taste of friction, the initial sign that habit would no longer be enough to guarantee participation. Ratings told one story. The initial viewership numbers for Thursday Night Football were respectable, impressive even considering the novelty of the time slot. Networks and league executives highlighted these metrics as proof of success. Fans were still watching, engagement remained high, and the perception of growth justified the experiment. But revenue told another story. Exclusive rights packages sold to networks and digital platforms shifted the calculus from communal participation to monetization. The priority was no longer cultural cohesion or habitual loyalty. The priority was financial leverage. By controlling access to a highly desirable, limited product, the league could command unprecedented sums from broadcast partners, streaming platforms, and advertisers. Ratings became secondary to revenue, but the two were presented publicly as harmonious. Behind the curtain, tension between fan experience and financial gain was quietly mounting. The early warning signs were subtle but significant. Fans expressed irritation at the scheduling change, noting the inconvenience of a midweek game. Conversation habits began to shift. Where Monday discussions had once recapped Sunday's collective experience, they now fractured. Some had watched Thursday games live, some delayed through recordings, and some did not watch at all. The shared reference points, the foundation of ritual and continuity, were beginning to erode. Yet these signs were largely ignored by league executives. The assumption was that fans would adapt. The experiments were positioned as innovations, not as probes that could reveal vulnerabilities in loyalty. Thursday Night Football also exposed a deeper tension between visibility and exclusivity. By placing games in a different time slot, sometimes on alternative networks or streaming platforms, the league began to fragment its audience intentionally. The experiment tested the elasticity of attention. How many games could fans track? How much scheduling friction could be introduced before devotion weakened? How far could loyalty stretch before it snapped under the weight of inconvenience and choice? For executives, the answers were measured in subscriptions, contracts, and metrics. For fans, the answers were more subtle, manifesting as fatigue, confusion, and the creeping sense that the sport was no longer fully predictable. The cultural consequences were immediate, even if invisible to the casual observer. Football had always thrived on predictability and habit. Sundays were guaranteed. Ritual was reinforced through repetition. Midweek interruptions forced fans to choose actively between obligations and devotion. Choice is not neutral. It introduces friction. Friction reduces automatic engagement. Thursday Night Football, in its early years, became a laboratory for this principle. The league observed how fans reacted to friction, how schedules could be manipulated, and how access could be conditional without provoking outright revolt. The experiment offered unprecedented insight into fan behavior, yet it was framed publicly as a benefit. Anecdotes from viewers illustrate the tension. One longtime fan described setting aside Thursday evening, only to discover his regional network did not carry the game. Another noted that the midweek timing conflicted with family routines, making attendance at a watch party impossible. Yet another lamented the loss of conversational cohesion. Monday office discussions no longer assumed universal awareness of key plays, creating social gaps where once there had been shared knowledge. These early reactions foreshadow the larger, more systemic fragmentation that would come as exclusive access and streaming rights proliferated. The warning signs were clear in the lived experience of fans, even if they were invisible in ratings charts. The league's response to these fractures was instructive. Rather than slowing or reconsidering the expansion, executives doubled down. Thursday Night Football became more prominent, more widely marketed, and more frequently scheduled. The implicit lesson was that the financial benefits outweighed cultural costs. The game was no longer merely a communal ritual. It was a product whose distribution could be strategically manipulated. Revenue became the axis around which decisions revolved, while fan experience was secondary. Loyalty was no longer an automatic byproduct of habit, it was a conditional resource to be leveraged, tested, and optimized. Thursday Night Football also highlighted an emerging tension between the fan as participant and the fan as consumer. Historically, devotion required little more than attention. Fans were present, ritual was reinforced, and engagement was organic. The new model required awareness, active management of access, and sometimes multiple subscriptions or platforms. The fan became a calculated agent in a system where attention had measurable value. Habits were no longer sufficient. Choice and effort defined engagement. And with effort came inequality. Those who could navigate the evolving landscape maintained access. Those who could not were excluded from the shared experience, often silently and without acknowledgement. The experiment extended beyond scheduling. Thursday Night Football began to influence advertising, sponsorship, and media strategies. The league's control over midweek broadcasts provided unprecedented leverage in negotiations. Networks paid premiums for exclusivity. Streaming platforms gained legitimacy by association. Fans, meanwhile, adapted or disengaged according to their capacity and willingness. The invisible war between access and loyalty had intensified. And the first concrete lesson was clear. Disruption could be profitable, but cultural cohesion was fragile. Looking back now, it is clear that Thursday Night Football was more than an additional game. It was a microcosm of the league's evolving priorities, a controlled test of the boundaries of fan devotion. It demonstrated that convenience could be redefined, loyalty could be conditional, and habit could be measured against revenue. The early signs of fracture were present in ratings, in subscriptions, and in anecdotes, but they were largely ignored. The consequences, subtle at first, were profound. Thursday Night Football was the moment the league began to experiment with the limits of devotion. The foundation of habitual engagement, the assumption that fans would follow the game because it was reliable, accessible, and communal, was deliberately challenged. Access was no longer universal. Participation was now conditional. The ritual, the habit, and the inheritance that had built loyalty over generations were tested against revenue and strategic expansion. The experiment was ongoing, and its results would shape the very definition of fandom for years to come. The fractures revealed by Thursday Night Football were instructive because they illustrated a simple but powerful truth. Devotion is resilient only when habit is reinforced. Introduce friction, and the fragile equilibrium begins to shift. Introduce conditional access, and loyalty must be actively earned rather than passively assumed. The league had discovered a model where experimentation could be measured in dollars and metrics, even if the cultural costs remained invisible to most observers. This controlled test foreshadowed the challenges of streaming, exclusivity, and subscription fatigue that would come to dominate the conversation in the years ahead. Thursday Night Football was a proving ground, a laboratory in which the league learned how to manipulate attention, how to monetize access, and how to fragment experience without immediate disruption. It was the first widely visible instance of a larger trend. The transformation of football from a communal ritual into a product distributed strategically and conditionally. The league recognized this leverage and was willing to capitalize on it, creating mutually beneficial arrangements where streaming platforms gained legitimacy and the league gained revenue. The consequences for fan experience were significant. Long-standing routines were disrupted. People accustomed to turning on a television and finding the game ready and accessible now had to consult schedules, determine platform compatibility, and, in some cases, pay for additional services. Loyalty could no longer be assumed. It had to be actively maintained, mediated by technology, and, increasingly, purchased. This transformation altered not only viewing habits, but the very social fabric of fandom. Executives from tech companies approached negotiations with precision. They understood that live football is a non-replicable asset. Unlike scripted content, which can be watched later, paused, or binged on demand, live games require presence in real time. This immediacy makes attention measurable, influence tangible, and advertising premium. The league's archives, history, and brand power created leverage in a marketplace where certainty is rare. The willingness of streaming platforms to outbid traditional networks revealed the stakes. Football was more than sport. It was a gateway to influence, credibility, and dominance in the broader media ecosystem. Fans, meanwhile, found themselves navigating a system they did not fully understand. Habit was insufficient. The assumption that football would arrive, accessible and communal, had been replaced with a reality where access was contingent on choices, subscriptions, and platforms. The rhythm of fandom was no longer guaranteed. Generational inheritance of ritual required effort, negotiation, and sometimes financial cost. The game itself remained constant in its rules and its drama, but the experience of engagement was transformed. The invisible contract between fan and league had shifted, and the power dynamics of that relationship were being redefined in ways that were subtle but profound. By entering the room, streaming platforms not only reshaped access, redefined the role of the fan. The audience was no longer a passive recipient of a universally available product. They were now participants in a transactional ecosystem, their devotion measured, their attention monetized, and their loyalty leveraged. The cultural implications of this shift are enormous. Football had once been inevitable. It had once been universal. It had once been embedded in the rhythms of life and the architecture of habit. Streaming changed all of that. It introduced conditionality, friction, and new hierarchies of access. This chapter of the story demonstrates that football, while consistent on the field, is malleable off it. Its value extends beyond points, yards, and victories into the realm of influence, authority, and legitimacy. Streaming platforms understood this, and their aggressive pursuit of rights reshaped the social contract between league and fan. The game remained, the players continued to compete, and the outcomes were as thrilling as ever. But the experience of fandom was transformed into something that required effort, knowledge, and participation in a system increasingly designed around leverage and control rather than accessibility and habit. The arrival of streaming was not merely about innovation or technology. It was about leverage, about cultural authority, and about the monetization of attention. The consequences for fans were both immediate and long-term. Access became conditional. Loyalty became transactional. Ritual became negotiable. and the shared cultural experience that had defined generations of football spectatorship began to fracture under the weight of strategy, finance, and technological ambition. Sunday had once been simple. It was the day that defined the week, the anchor in a rhythm of work, school, and family. Football arrived at predictable times, on predictable channels, with predictable outcomes in terms of access. Families gathered in living rooms, neighbors discussed games on porches, and friends debated plays in offices and cafeterias. The ritual was nearly sacred. The collective experience was immediate, unifying, and effortless. But as streaming platforms proliferated, Sunday began to splinter. What had been a single, universal moment of engagement became fragmented across multiple services, devices, and feeds. The universality of experience, the shared cultural baseline that had once bound fans together, began to erode. The splintering was both subtle and profound. Instead of one channel providing access to every marquee matchup, fans now had to navigate a labyrinth of platforms. A single afternoon could require subscriptions to multiple services, each with its own interface, login process, and streaming quality. Fans were forced into active choices, weighing convenience, cost, and coverage. The effortless habit that had once defined Sundays became an exercise in management. Fans could no longer assume that a game they wished to watch would be universally accessible. The ritual itself was interrupted by barriers that did not exist previously. This fragmentation extended beyond the screen. Conversations, once grounded in shared moments, began to fracture. Monday morning office chatter or casual lunchtime debates relied on common reference points. Those who had access to one platform could discuss key plays. Those who had missed them due to platform restrictions were left out. The shared language of football, the lexicon built over decades through simultaneous viewership, was being undermined. What once had been an automatic communal literacy now required effort to achieve. Fans were no longer simply participants in a cultural moment. They were navigating a system that dictated the terms of engagement. The emotional impact of this shift was tangible. Fans described frustration at missing critical plays or struggling to coordinate access across devices. Parents juggled family schedules to accommodate multiple streams. Young viewers, accustomed to immediacy and convenience in digital media, encountered the paradox of abundant content paired with restricted access. Enthusiasm remained, but it was now accompanied by anxiety and uncertainty. The once predictable rhythm of fandom was replaced by negotiation and contingency. Habit, which had previously reinforced loyalty, was now insufficient. Devotion required effort, and effort is not evenly distributed across households. Networks and platforms framed these changes as choice and innovation. Fans were presented with options to tailor their experience, to select the games they most desired to watch. In practice, choice often meant division. The communal baseline of access was replaced by selective, individualized engagement. Some fans had full access to marquee games. Others were restricted to secondary matchups. Some relied on delayed broadcasts, missing the immediacy that had historically reinforced cultural cohesion. The Sunday ritual, once universal, became segmented, conditional, and, in many ways, unpredictable. This splintering had deeper implications for identity and culture. Loyalty, once inherited through generational exposure, now required active navigation and financial participation. Parents could no longer assume that children would watch the same games without intervention or guidance. Friends in different cities, or even across town, could experience entirely different games, undermining the assumption of shared knowledge and shared emotional investment. Ritual was disrupted. Familiarity was replaced with negotiation. Collective experience was replaced by individualized consumption. Exclusivity created demand, and the perception of scarcity reinforced the importance of each game. Ratings were measured across platforms, subscriptions were counted, and engagement metrics were mined for insights. From a business perspective, the Splintered Sunday was a success. From a cultural perspective, it was a disruption. One that subtly eroded the habitual, ritualized engagement that had historically anchored fandom. The Splintered Sunday also amplified the cognitive load for fans. What had been an effortless habit now required planning, awareness, and occasionally, trial and error. A fan had to know which game was on which platform, which device could support the stream, and whether they had active subscriptions. The process, repeated weekly, transformed a once automatic ritual into a deliberate strategy. The joy of engagement was complicated by the mechanics of access. Friction, even small, had a cumulative effect. Over time, it altered the psychology of fandom. Attendance, viewership, and attention remained high, but the nature of devotion shifted fundamentally. Fans began to experiment with alternatives. Social media, highlight reels, and clips became substitutes for live viewing. Where once the experience of a game was complete only in real time, segmented streaming encouraged partial engagement. The shared temporal experience, central to football's cultural dominance, weakened. Emotional investment persisted, but the mechanisms that reinforced habit and identity were increasingly mediated by technology, convenience, and selective access. The rhythm of Sunday had been fractured into discrete, individualized experiences, each shaped by platform strategy rather than communal tradition. The league itself was complicit in this transformation. Its partnerships with multiple streaming platforms and networks created intentional fragmentation. Exclusive rights deals were sold not only for revenue, but also for leverage in negotiations. Brand positioning and market dominance. The fan experience was secondary to strategic advantage. In practice, this meant that the assumption of access, the invisible social contract that had underpinned loyalty for generations, was no longer valid. Participation became contingent on choice, subscription, and awareness. The universality of football was replaced by conditional engagement. This fragmentation also affected the perception of the sports narrative. With multiple games on multiple platforms, fans missed moments that once would have been shared universally. Upsets, milestones, and record-setting performances were no longer universally witnessed. Collective memory, a crucial element in reinforcing identity and community, became segmented. Fans discussed what happened in the game I watched rather than what happened in the league today. The shared cultural ledger of football was no longer maintained in real time. Experience was individualized, memory was selective, and the continuity of narrative was fractured. In this new environment, the question of loyalty became complex. It was no longer a function of habit or inherited tradition. Fans had to navigate access, negotiate barriers, and sometimes accept that they could not participate fully. Devotion required effort, attention, and resources. The cost of engagement was no longer purely emotional. It was operational. The invisible contract that had guaranteed loyalty through presence was replaced by a system that required negotiation, navigation, and compliance with multiple platforms. Habit alone could no longer sustain fandom. The Splintered Sunday illustrates the beginning of a deeper cultural transformation. What had once been a shared ritual, effortless and communal, became individualized, conditional, and fragmented. Platforms, subscriptions, and exclusive rights replaced habit with effort, continuity with segmentation, and universality with selective availability. The rhythm of life that had been anchored in the certainty of football was now punctuated by friction, planning, and sometimes disappointment. Fans continued to engage, but the nature of engagement, the psychology of devotion, and the communal bonds of fandom were being reshaped fundamentally. This chapter in the evolution of football demonstrates that accessibility is not simply a matter of convenience. It is the invisible infrastructure that sustains loyalty, identity, and cultural cohesion. When access becomes fragmented, when multiple platforms divide attention, when ritual is replaced by negotiation, the social fabric of fandom begins to unravel. The Splintered Sunday is both a symptom and a cause of the larger transformations in football culture, reflecting the consequences of strategy, technology, and monetization on the collective experience of fans. The continuity of ritual, which had reinforced loyalty and identity, was now fractured by the mechanics of globalization. Time zone strain became a recurring theme in fan commentary. Emotional investment, which had once been reinforced through simultaneous observation, became fragmented. Global expansion also reinforced the transactional nature of access. Fans needed subscriptions, devices, and knowledge of platforms to participate fully. The more the league pursued international growth, the more complex the domestic experience became. Ritual was no longer seamless. Loyalty was no longer effortless. Access required calculation, negotiation, and effort. Global exposure promised long-term growth that would cement the NFL's position as a preeminent entertainment brand. Fans who had carried the sport culturally, emotionally, and socially for decades were now asked to bend, adapt, and negotiate their engagement. Their loyalty was still present, but it was being tested in new ways, mediated by technology, scheduling, and strategic priorities. International games brought prestige, revenue, and exposure, but they also disrupted rituals, fractured communal engagement, and imposed cognitive and emotional costs on fans. Cultural erosion is subtle, cumulative, and often invisible in traditional metrics. The promise of international prestige comes with the cost of domestic continuity. The league's pursuit of a global footprint illustrates the tension between expansion and the preservation of ritual. Between measurable success and intangible cohesion, fans continue to watch, cheer, and debate. But the rhythm, accessibility, and universality that had historically defined the sport have been altered. The shift from habit-driven fandom to data-driven engagement marked one of the most profound transformations in the modern NFL. For decades, loyalty had been built organically through repeated rituals, communal experience, and the inherent drama of the game itself. Attendance, viewership, and devotion were measured in broad strokes: ratings, ticket sales, anecdotal observation, and fan culture. But as streaming platforms proliferated and the league increasingly partnered with technology companies, fans themselves became data points. Patterns of attention shape decisions about which games are broadcast, how they are marketed, and even how content is structured. The human experience of devotion is replaced by an optimization problem: how to maximize retention, subscriptions, and measurable attention. The League and its partners increasingly use these insights to segment access strategically. Games were curated, promoted, and priced according to predicted behavior. Fans were nudged toward specific matchups, incentivized to subscribe, and encouraged to engage in ways that reinforced measurable outcomes. What had once been a universal, culturally embedded ritual was now mediated by algorithms and metrics. Attendance at a live event or viewership of a broadcast was no longer simply evidence of loyalty, was an input in a feedback loop designed to maximize revenue. Every choice, delay, or lapse was data that could be leveraged to influence behavior. Fans themselves began to perceive the shift, often subconsciously. The once effortless habit of watching football became a navigation of options, alerts, and suggestions. Notifications prompted engagement. Personalized recommendations guided viewing choices. Subscription tiers dictated access. Fans who previously relied on routine now contended with conditionality. Their attention, once automatic, was actively managed by algorithms designed to maximize retention. The psychology of fandom was altered. Devotion became transactional, mediated, and measurable. Habit alone was no longer sufficient to guarantee participation. The consequences for culture and ritual were significant. When loyalty is reduced to numbers, the social contract between fan and league is fundamentally altered. Devotion is no longer inherited through communal exposure or ritual reinforcement. It is earned, quantified, and maintained under the watchful eye of data analytics. These experiences underscore a broader truth. Fandom has become operationalized. The intimate, emotional connection to the game is inseparable from the technological and commercial systems that now govern access. This new system also created inequality among fans. Those with the resources, knowledge, and flexibility to navigate multiple platforms were able to maintain full participation. Others, constrained by time, technology, or finances, found themselves increasingly marginalized. Yet, this control came at a cost. The cultural, emotional, and ritualistic dimensions of fandom were increasingly subordinated to calculable outcomes. By reducing devotion to metrics, the NFL and its partners effectively shifted the locus of authority. Fans, once the primary arbiters of cultural relevance through habitual engagement, were now operating within a system designed to measure, predict, and monetize their behavior. The invisible contract between league and fan was replaced by an explicit system of measurement and control. Engagement became a resource, attention a commodity, and devotion a variable to be optimized. The consequences ripple across culture, identity, and the emotional life of fandom. This chapter underscores a fundamental tension in modern football. The game itself remains consistent, thrilling, and emotionally resonant, but the framework in which fans engage has been transformed. Devotion is no longer merely habit or inheritance. It is quantified, optimized, and mediated through technology. Fans remain engaged, but the experience of fandom is profoundly altered. Ritual, continuity, and communal identity are secondary to metrics, algorithms, and measurable outcomes. The invisible architecture that once sustained loyalty has been replaced by a system that observes, measures, and manipulates attention with unprecedented precision. The modern NFL is built on spectacle, strategy, and sheer athleticism. Yet beneath the glimmering stadium lights and soaring television ratings lies a quieter story: the silent exit of older fans. These are the viewers who grew up with Sunday afternoons defined by ritual, whose memories of football were interwoven with family, community, and cultural rhythm. For decades, they watched without friction. Television brought games directly into their living rooms. Access was universal. Devotion required little more than habit. But as the league moved aggressively into streaming, exclusive packages, and global expansion, the very structures that had sustained their engagement began to erode. The result was a form of attrition that is largely invisible, unmeasured, and yet profoundly significant. Accessibility barriers have become the most tangible hurdle for this demographic. Older fans often lack familiarity with streaming technology, subscription models, and multi-platform navigation. A game that once required nothing more than turning on the television now demands passwords, apps, devices, and sometimes additional fees. For some, the complexity of access is daunting. The emotional energy required to maintain participation grows disproportionately with age and technological literacy. Frustration, confusion, and fatigue replace the effortless enjoyment of football's ritual. Many fans, when confronted with these barriers repeatedly, make the quiet decision to disengage rather than wrestle with a system designed for a younger, digitally fluent audience. Cultural alienation compounds the problem. Football's identity has historically been communal, grounded in shared experiences, narratives, and rituals. The younger audience navigates fragmented schedules, exclusive platforms, and algorithmic recommendations with ease. They adapt to time zone changes, global games, and midweek broadcasts. Older fans, however, are more vulnerable to feeling disconnected from these shifts. When access is gated, when rituals are disrupted, and when communal participation is no longer seamless, the sense of belonging diminishes. Fans who once felt central to the football ecosystem begin to feel peripheral. They are still emotionally invested in the sport, but excluded from the structures that now define engagement. The psychological effect is subtle but cumulative. This silent exit is also difficult to quantify, which allows it to persist unnoticed. Ratings often reflect live viewership across the general population, but they fail to capture who has stopped watching altogether. Older fans are less likely to navigate digital platforms or experiment with subscriptions. Their absence is not a spike in unsubscribed accounts or dropped ratings, but a slow attrition that erodes the demographic base that once provided both stability and cultural legitimacy. The decline is invisible to executives focused on metrics, revenue, and engagement from younger, tech-savvy audiences. The audience is changing, but the change is unobserved in the traditional sense. Stories from fans illustrate the emotional dimension of this phenomenon. One longtime viewer recalled the frustration of learning that a beloved Team S game was only available on a platform he did not know how to access. He described the emotional toll of repeated attempts to engage, only to fail and feel disconnected. Another fan noted that even when he could access the game, the experience was mediated through unfamiliar apps or interfaces, diminishing the sense of immersion he had once enjoyed. The game itself had not changed, but the fans' relationship with it had shifted dramatically. Loyalty remained, but the cost of participation had increased, creating a quiet disengagement that is difficult to observe but real in experience. The impact on tradition is profound. Football, once a multi-generational ritual, now faces the erosion of foundational participants. The passage of fandom from parents to children relied on shared access, routine, and continuity. When older fans disengage, the bridge that transmits cultural knowledge and narrative to younger generations weakens. The ritual becomes less organic, more mediated, and more contingent on technology, rather than shared experience. The loss is not only quantitative, it is cultural. Fans who leave silently take with them decades of accumulated stories, insights, and emotional investment. The history of the league, experienced and internalized by generations, begins to fade from memory in real time. The systemic implications are equally significant. While younger, tech-savvy fans are measured and monetized effectively, the departure of older viewers represents a gap in cultural cohesion. Ratings may remain stable and revenue may continue to grow. But the social contract between league and audience is being altered. Engagement is increasingly conditional, mediated by platforms, subscriptions, and digital literacy. Devotion that once flowed naturally through habit is now contingent on navigating a system designed without consideration for a segment of the audience. This silent exit is a casualty of progress, yet one that is rarely acknowledged. The qualitative dimension of this trend underscores the human cost. Fans who disengage do not often express outrage or protest. They are not writing to networks, engaging on social media, or publicly critiquing access barriers. Instead, they leave quietly, turning away from a game they once loved because participation has become effortful rather than intuitive. The absence is measured only in the spaces they once occupied, the living rooms, offices, and communal gatherings where football had been central. It is a loss that is intimate and profound, affecting not just viewership but the emotional and cultural landscape of fandom. This exit is also generationally specific. Younger audiences who grew up with digital platforms, algorithms, and fragmentation perceive access as normal, even expected. They adapt to subscription models, exclusive games, and algorithmically curated experiences with relative ease. Older fans, for whom the sport was once inevitable, experience these changes as disruption. The psychological friction is higher, the cultural displacement more acute. Devotion persists, but the structures that once supported it have eroded, creating a silent demographic shift that is largely unobserved but deeply consequential. The silent exit of older fans also intersects with broader trends in media consumption. Streaming, on-demand services, and exclusive rights packages have reshaped expectations and behavior across industries. Football, as a cultural touchstone, reflects these broader shifts acutely because of its ritualized nature. Unlike scripted entertainment, which can be consumed asynchronously with minimal impact on communal experience, live sports rely on real-time engagement and shared attention. When foundational participants exit silently, the entire ecosystem of ritual, storytelling, and communal reference points begins to erode. The league's approach to this demographic shift has been largely reactive rather than proactive. Older fans are not a primary target for technological innovation or subscription strategies. Marketing focuses on digital fluency, engagement metrics, and platform adoption. The result is a widening gap between the expectations of the league and the lived experience of a cohort that had historically provided stability, cultural legitimacy, and intergenerational continuity. Devotion remains, but it is increasingly unreciprocated by accessible, predictable engagement opportunities. Ultimately, this silent exit demonstrates the fragility of loyalty when habit is disrupted and access becomes conditional. Fans are not abandoning the sport out of disinterest. They are leaving because the structures that made participation effortless and meaningful have been replaced with complexity, exclusivity, and technological friction. Cultural alienation, operational barriers, and unmeasured attrition combine to create a demographic shift that is invisible in metrics, but real in experience. The invisible contract that once ensured loyalty through predictability, habit, and access has been quietly broken. And the consequences for football culture are profound, subtle, and cumulative. Where older viewers grew up with Sundays defined by ritual, communal gathering, and predictable access, younger fans experience football as fragmented, transactional, and mediated through technology. Loyalty, once a cultural inheritance, has become conditional, segmented, and shaped by platforms rather than tradition. The once seamless Sunday ritual is replaced by a patchwork of opportunities, notifications, and intermittent participation. Instead of a cohesive cultural experience, engagement occurs in isolated pockets. It's often mediated by social media, highlight reels, and curated clips. Ritual, a cornerstone of loyalty, is weakened when access is conditional and inconsistent. The sense of belonging that comes from shared experiences, living room gatherings, office discussions, communal chances, diminished. Inherited loyalty has also diminished. Historically, parents transmitted devotion to children through habit and exposure. The transfer of cultural memory and ritualized devotion is disrupted, leaving new fans to construct attachment in a landscape defined by conditional access and technological mediation. Record-breaking performances or historic moments may be missed entirely or consumed asynchronously through highlights, reducing the depth of emotional investment. The collective memory of the league, which once strengthened identity and attachment, is now uneven and mediated by selective exposure. Where older fans once participated effortlessly, younger fans are incentivized to participate strategically. Children growing up in fragmented households may develop interest and enthusiasm, but without the immersive context and ritualized reinforcement of previous generations, attachment is shallower and more contingent. Fragmented access, conditional engagement, and weakened ritual have created an environment in which loyalty is transactional, attachment is shallower, and inherited devotion is disrupted. Fans remain enthusiastic, but the emotional depth, continuity, and communal reinforcement that once defined fandom have been fundamentally altered. The consequences ripple through households, communities, and culture, reshaping what it means to be a football fan in the era of streaming, exclusivity, and algorithmic mediation. Technology has made it possible to watch nearly any game, anywhere, at any time, yet that very convenience has introduced a new set of burdens. Subscription fatigue has become a defining characteristic of contemporary fandom. Where once access to football required a single television connection, now fans are confronted with a patchwork of platforms, each with its own cost, requirements, and restrictions. The promise of seamless engagement masks the reality. Paying more for fragmented, uncertain access has become a psychological strain, slowly eroding the emotional connection that once made football effortless, habitual, and culturally central. Subscription fatigue is both literal and psychological. Fans are asked to subscribe to multiple streaming services, maintain device compatibility, and navigate the shifting landscape of exclusive rights deals. A single season may require a combination of cable packages, streaming subscriptions, and app-based purchases, each with its own fees and limitations. The cost of total access, both financial and cognitive, has risen sharply. Each week, devotion becomes an exercise in negotiation rather than instinctive engagement. Financial burden is compounded by uncertainty. Paying for access no longer guarantees full participation. Blackout restrictions, platform-specific exclusives, and scheduling changes can prevent fans from watching the games they want in real time. Fans are now paying more for access that is less reliable, less consistent, and more mediated than ever before. Loyalty, once nurtured through ritual and habit, is now contingent upon successfully navigating the infrastructure of monetized access. The invisible architecture that once supported communal participation and emotional continuity has been replaced by a transactional, conditional system that privileges engagement as a commodity rather than a shared experience. Psychological disengagement is the inevitable outcome. As the cognitive, financial, and logistical burdens accumulate, even the most passionate fans experience diminishing returns. The joy of spontaneous participation is replaced by stress and calculation. Emotional investment is diminished not because the game has lost meaning, but because participation has become effortful, fragmented, and mediated. Subscription fatigue, unpredictable access, and transactional engagement reshape the nature of fandom. The price of convenience is ultimately paid in emotional currency. Fans are present, engaged, and watching, but their relationship to the sport is altered. Loyalty is no longer a given. It is earned through effort, strategy, and resilience. Engagement is measured not by devotion or habit, but by successful negotiation of fragmented access and subscription requirements. The cumulative effect is subtle, pervasive, and deeply consequential. The fan experience has changed, and with it, the culture, continuity, and emotional infrastructure of football fandom. The NFL's evolution from a culturally embedded institution to a commercially optimized enterprise has shifted its allegiance in ways that are subtle but profound. Where once the league's primary responsibility was to its fans, the people who filled stadiums tuned in on Sundays and carried the narratives of teams from one generation to the next. The focus has increasingly turned toward media partners, streaming platforms, and contractual obligations. Decisions that once prioritized accessibility, ritual, and communal engagement are now governed by considerations of revenue, strategic partnerships, and leverage over distribution networks. The balance of power, once firmly in favor of fans as the natural audience and cultural arbiters, has tilted decisively toward those who control platforms, subscriptions, and market access. This transformation has been gradual, but unmistakable. For decades, broadcast television served as the linchpin of fan access. Networks competed to deliver games to a universal audience, and the league's policies were designed to maximize reach rather than restrict it. Sunday afternoons were predictable, equitable, and culturally synchronous. Fans were the central stakeholders. Their habits, loyalties, and engagement dictated scheduling, marketing, and presentation. The league's priorities were aligned with the maintenance of habit, ritual, and broad-based devotion, recognizing that long-term cultural loyalty translated into ratings, ticket sales, and sustained brand value. Networks began negotiating exclusive rights, fragmenting access, and leveraging premium channels to extract additional revenue. The implications were not immediately visible, but the pattern was set. Rights deals are no longer merely transactional. They are strategic exercises in market dominance. The consequences for power balance are profound. Media partners possessing the tools of distribution now exert influence over when, where, and how games are delivered. Platforms can dictate the terms of engagement, which games are available, in what formats, and to which audiences. The league, dependent on these partnerships for revenue, brand legitimacy, and global expansion, adjusts policies and practices to maintain alignment with the strategic priorities of these stakeholders. Fans, while essential in theory, have become secondary in practical authority. Their loyalty, once the primary driver of league decisions, is now a measured variable in a broader system of revenue, maximization, and contractual compliance. Contractual obligations also shape internal decision-making. Exclusive rights deals, platform agreements, and negotiated revenue shares create structural incentives that favor media partners over fans. Scheduling decisions, blackout policies, and access restrictions are increasingly dictated by the imperatives of contracts rather than the rhythms of fan habit. The result is a subtle but pervasive inversion. The league is obligated first to partners, whose leverage derives from the economic and technological control they wield, and secondarily to the fans who generate cultural legitimacy and sustained engagement. This inversion reshapes the relationship between audience and institution, altering expectations, loyalty, and the emotional infrastructure of fandom. The implications for fan perception are significant. Devoted followers, accustomed to predictable access and communal experience, experience friction, confusion, and occasional alienation. The emotional contract between league and audience, the unspoken expectation that devotion is reciprocated with access and reliabilities under strain. The emotional infrastructure of fandom, rooted in tradition, expectation, and collective experiences, increasingly subordinated to transactional and contractual imperatives. Psychologically, this dynamic reshapes fan experience. Awareness that engagement is contingent, measured, and secondary to contractual priorities introduces subtle tension. Devotion is maintained, but it is conditional. In sum, the NFL today operates within a system in which media partners, technological leverage, and contractual obligations define priorities. Fans, while central in theory, are increasingly secondary in practical authority. Decisions regarding scheduling, access, and presentation are governed by revenue optimization, strategic alignment, and partnership compliance rather than communal habit, inherited loyalty, or cultural expectation. The balance of power has shifted, subtly but irrevocably, creating a dynamic in which the fan is observed, measured, and accommodated, but no longer positioned as the primary arbiter of experience, access, or devotion. The NFL markets itself as a league of accessibility, a sport that can be watched anywhere, anytime, on any device. The league reinforces this perception through advertising, app interfaces, and subscription messaging. Access is not universal. It is mediated by technology, contracts, and device compatibility. Algorithmic mediation further complicates the picture. Platforms curate what fans see when they see it and how they experience it. The rhetoric of access also obscures inequality. Fans with multiple subscriptions, up-to-date devices, and technological fluency can approximate the promised freedom, while those without these resources encounter barriers that diminish participation. The fan schedule, previously aligned with the natural rhythms of the game, must now adapt to technological and contractual constraints. The illusion is further reinforced by marketing and cultural messaging. The narrative of freedom remains compelling, but the lived experience contradicts it. Fans who encounter these barriers frequently are at risk of disengagement, alienation, and fragmentation. The fan experiences freedom, but it is carefully constructed, measured, and circumscribed. Fans did not measure their devotion in dollars spent or apps downloaded. Emotional attachment passed from generation to generation, created a sense of identity rooted in place, culture, and community. This emotional loyalty was resilient because it was cultivated over decades. Fans invested time, attention, and passion in the league not because it was convenient, but because it was meaningful. Wins and losses, triumphs and heartbreaks were absorbed into the fabric of daily life, giving rhythm and texture to communal and familial interactions. The post-game discussions formed a continuous loop of emotional engagement that required no intermediaries, subscriptions, or digital mediation. The fan was central, the experience was direct, and devotion was unconditional. Access is mediated by contracts, platforms, and algorithms. The once straightforward bond between fan and team is now entangled with transactional infrastructure, making emotional investments simultaneously more fragile and more contingent. Families, workplaces, and neighborhoods functioned as microcosms of a larger fan culture, passing knowledge, stories, and values across generations. When access is fragmented and mediated, these structures weaken. Emotional attachment is particularly affected in younger generations of fans, whose fandom develops in a landscape dominated by transactional structures. Without inherited rituals, communal continuity, or guaranteed access, attachment becomes a matter of selective engagement rather than ingrained devotion. Emotional investment is strained by effort, uncertainty, and conditionality. The story of what loyalty used to mean is a reminder that fandom was once a living, breathing cultural institution. Emotional investment, habit, ritual, and continuity formed the foundation of the fan's identity. Devotion was measured not by transactions, but by presence, participation, and emotional resilience. Fans remain connected, yet the emotional depth, cultural embedding, and intergenerational continuity that once defined devotion have been fundamentally altered. The NFL has long operated under the assumption that its brand, scale, and cultural dominance make it impervious to missteps. This too-big-to-fail thinking is woven into the league's strategic DNA. Decisions are made with the confidence that no matter how fragmented access becomes, no matter how transactional the fan experience, the gravitational pull of football, its storied history, and its deep cultural embedding will ensure continued engagement. Yet the league's historical parallels and the experiences of other sports organizations offer cautionary lessons. Growth, innovation, and expansion are not guarantees of enduring loyalty. Failure to heed early warning signs can have lasting consequences. And history has repeatedly demonstrated that even the most dominant institutions are vulnerable when hubris and structural blind spots overshadow the realities of audience behavior. Other leagues provide instructive examples. In European soccer, clubs once assumed that global broadcast rights, sponsorship revenue, and international branding would sustain fan engagement regardless of access, pricing, or ritual. Yet fragmented access, subscription fatigue, and alienation of traditional supporters created backlash, diminished local loyalty, and fractured fan bases. Fans who once attended matches, participated in communal rituals, and felt ownership of local narratives began to disengage when accessibility became transactional and mediated. The league risks confusing measured engagement with authentic emotional investment, underestimating the fragility of loyalty when structural, transactional, and technological barriers accumulate. Historical parallels extend beyond sports. Entertainment industries, media conglomerates, and cultural institutions have repeatedly encountered the consequences of overestimating the resilience of their audience. When accessibility, continuity, and emotional connection are subordinated to monetization, engagement becomes conditional, loyalty erodes, and audience fragmentation intensifies. Institutions that fail to adapt risk long-term consequences that may not be immediately visible in quarterly, Revenue, but manifests over decades in cultural relevance, fan attachment, and community integration. The NFL, despite its dominance, is not immune to these forces. Hubris and scale can mask vulnerability, creating the illusion of stability, while the underlying structures of engagement deteriorate. The psychological dimension is equally relevant. Fans are increasingly aware of the transactional and conditional nature of their engagement. Subscription fatigue, fragmented access, and algorithmic mediation create tension between desire and participation. While loyalty persists, it exists under strain, subject to disruption by factors outside the fan's control. The league's confidence in its own indispensability may obscure the fact that engagement is now contingent, mediated, and increasingly vulnerable to disruption. Historical lessons emphasize that scale and revenue cannot substitute for emotional, cultural, and habitual loyalty. Younger fans grow up in a landscape of mediated, transactional, and fragmented engagement. The league may interpret engagement metrics or subscription numbers as evidence of enduring loyalty, yet these measures obscure the fragility inherent in conditional participation. When fans encounter frustration due to blackout restrictions, subscription fatigue, or platform limitations, the league may prioritize contractual obligations over accessibility, reinforcing perceptions of indifference. In conclusion, the NFL's confidence in its invulnerability carries both opportunity and risk. The league's dominance, global reach, and financial success provide leverage and influence unmatched in professional sports. Yet these advantages coexist with fragility introduced by transactional structures, fragmented access, and conditional engagement. Historical lessons from other leagues and industries reveal that unchecked hubris can produce cultural erosion, weakening emotional loyalty and communal identity, even as financial metrics appear robust. The NFL's challenge is to navigate growth while preserving the qualitative, emotional, and ritualized elements that constitute the foundation of enduring fandom. Too big to fail thinking can blind decision-makers to these realities, leaving a league of immense power exposed to the subtle but consequential dynamics of cultural fragility, transactional loyalty, and generational change. The NFL has entered a landscape from which there is no simple return. The streaming model, once embraced as a pathway to innovation, global reach, and monetization, has introduced structural changes that are effectively irreversible. Contracts, technological dependencies, and platform alignments are embedded within the league's operational and economic framework. Fans, once unified by shared access and habitual ritual, are now conditioned to engage in fragmented, conditional, and transactional ways. Even if the league wished to restore universal, unfettered access, the inertia of existing systems, economic interests, and technological infrastructure would make such a reversal practically impossible. The future is not a matter of choice. It is the consequence of decisions already enacted, cumulative effects that cannot be undone, and a cultural landscape that has shifted fundamentally. What has already been lost is subtle but profound. Ritualized viewing, once predictable and communal, has been fractured by platform exclusivity, subscription tiers, and algorithmic mediation. Fans no longer experience the same shared temporal rhythms. The cadence of Sunday afternoons has been disrupted. Intergenerational continuity has weakened. Knowledge, stories, and passion that were once passed seamlessly from parent to child now encounter obstacles in the form of conditional access, streaming fragmentation, and technological complexity. Even long-standing fans, once confident in the stability of their devotion, experience uncertainty, fatigue, and alienation. Habits, once unconscious and cultural, now require deliberate effort and navigation. The texture of fandom, the shared narratives, the communal identity, the emotional continuity has been eroded. Transactional loyalty is now the norm. Fans are compelled to make strategic choices about which games to follow, which subscriptions to maintain, and how to allocate attention. Engagement is quantified, measured, and conditioned by technological infrastructure and contractual obligations rather than purely emotional resonance. The intimate relationship between fan and team, once cultivated through ritual, habit, and cultural embedding, is now mediated through screens, apps, and payment gateways. Devotion persists, but it exists under new constraints that redefine its depth, resilience, and quality. Emotional investment has not disappeared, but it is increasingly contingent, conditional, and mediated. Younger generations are particularly affected. Their fandom develops in an environment dominated by conditional access, subscription fatigue, and fragmented experiences. Emotional investment is present, yet it is less continuous, less coherent, and less deeply embedded. Inherited loyalty, the invisible cultural thread that once connected generations, is attenuated. Fans are still engaged, but the nature of that engagement is fundamentally different from what it was in the era of universal broadcast access. The cultural fabric has changed, and these shifts are not reversible. Global expansion compounds the challenge. International games, streaming rights sold across regions, and time zone adjustments introduce variability that strains continuity. Fans across geographies experience the sport differently, and the once unifying ritual of synchronous engagement is increasingly fragmented. While revenue and global visibility increase, the emotional and cultural cohesion that historically defined loyalty is increasingly fragile. Expansion, while financially advantageous, contributes to the irreversibility of the changes already imposed on fan experience. Psychological consequences are pervasive. Fans navigate cognitive and emotional fatigue, constantly balancing desire for engagement against practical constraints. Subscription management, platform navigation, and conditional access introduce friction that erodes effortless devotion. Rituals are interrupted, narratives are consumed asynchronously, and shared experiences are diluted. Fans maintain connection, yet the experience is mediated, transactional, and occasionally alienating. Rights are sold in multi-year arrangements. Infrastructure is optimized for platform-specific delivery. And audience behavior is measured, analyzed, and monetized. Economic incentives, technological complexity, and contractual obligations are self-reinforcing, embedding the streaming paradigm as the default mode of operation. The future, by design, cannot be rewound. Cultural and emotional erosion is already measurable. Ritualized communal habits have been replaced by episodic, mediated engagement. Fans experience alienation from traditional patterns, interruption of inherited loyalty, and conditional attachment. What was once seamless, instinctive, and habitual is now strategic, transactional, and fragmented. Devotion persists, but the texture of that devotion has changed fundamentally. Fans are present, yet the collective heartbeat of shared experience, which once defined identity and reinforced culture, has been disrupted in ways that cannot be undone. Rituals may disappear, intergenerational knowledge transfer may falter, and the cultural cohesion that historically defined football fandom may erode. Even the most engaged fans risk fatigue, disengagement, or alienation as the structural and transactional burdens of access accumulate. What remains at risk is not just viewership, but the emotional and cultural lifeblood of the sport itself. Yet, within this reality, there are opportunities for adaptation, reflection, and preservation. Fans, leagues, and platforms can recognize the consequences of conditional access and work to balance revenue objectives with cultural continuity. Strategies may emerge to preserve ritual, facilitate communal participation, and maintain emotional investment. However, any intervention must contend with the structural and technological momentum of the current model. Reversal is unlikely, mitigation is possible. The streaming paradigm is embedded, and the consequences of prior decisions are permanent. Streaming has altered the rules, both practically and culturally. Fans have lost elements of ritual, accessibility, and continuity. Emotional and cultural attachment has been reshaped, and the legacy of unconditional generational loyalty is compromised. What remains at risk is the very fabric of devotion, the communal heartbeat, the rituals, and the emotional continuity that made football more than a game. The league, The fans and the culture must navigate this altered landscape, fully aware that the past cannot be recovered and the future will bear the imprint of these irreversible transformations. And the faint hum of a fan base, fragmented by technological, contractual, and transactional structures. An inherited storytelling. It now carries the echo of what has been lost: ritual, habit, and continuity displaced by platforms, subscriptions, and conditional access. The roar may still exist, but it is no longer unified, no longer communal. It is fractured, episodic, and mediated. Fans are conditioned to navigate a complex ecosystem of platforms, each with its own rules, schedules, and limitations. Access is no longer universal or guaranteed. It is contingent upon compliance with technology, contractual agreements, and financial obligations. The very fabric of fandom has been altered. Emotional devotion persists, but it exists within the constraints imposed by partners, algorithms, and infrastructure. The bond between fan and team, once intuitive and instinctive, is now mediated and conditional, measured against effort and accessibility, rather than lived experience and communal continuity. Cultural fragmentation has followed naturally from these structural changes. Generational loyalty, once the invisible thread connecting parent to child, is increasingly disrupted. Stories, rituals, and knowledge that once passed effortlessly from one household to another are now mediated through technology and conditional access. Younger fans grow up in a landscape where games are episodic. Engagement is transactional, and participation requires negotiation and effort. The rituals that once anchored attachment watching games live, discussing plays with peers and family, attending in-person events are disrupted. Continuity, communal participation, and intergenerational identity are compromised. The NFL may be larger, wealthier, and more visible than ever, but the shared heartbeat of fandom, which once defined the cultural essence of the sport, has been fractured. This fragmentation has profound implications beyond mere viewership. Football was historically more than a game. It was a cultural touchstone, a shared language, a vehicle for belonging. Communities, families, neighborhoods, workplaces relied on the rhythms of the sport to structure social interaction, transmit values, and reinforce identity. With conditional access, algorithmic mediation, and subscription fatigue, these structures are weakened. Fans may follow the sport individually, yet the collective, communal dimension of experience has diminished. The NFL has traded universality for leverage, continuity for monetization, and cohesion for platform strategy. The social and emotional scaffolding that once supported decades of engagement has been partially dismantled. The cost of progress is evident, not just in structural terms, but in the psychological texture of fandom. The ease, certainty, and continuity that once defined devotion have been replaced with effort, negotiation, and fatigue. Fans must navigate blackout restrictions, multiple subscriptions, regional disparities, and platform-specific rules. Emotional investment exists, yet it is increasingly mediated by practical constraints and transactional dynamics. Rituals have been disrupted, narratives consumed asynchronously, and communal participation diminished. The fan's experience is no longer effortless or instinctive. It is negotiated, conditional, and sometimes frustrating. Devotion persists, but the texture of that devotion has been fundamentally altered. Historical parallels underscore the stakes. Other leagues, cultural institutions, and industries that prioritized monetization over continuity demonstrate that even dominant organizations are vulnerable to erosion of attachment. Scale and financial success do not guarantee cultural permanence. Fans who encounter repeated friction, whether through fragmented access, subscription fatigue, or algorithmic mediation, gradually recalibrate their engagement. The fan base may remain substantial, but its cohesion, continuity, and ritualized identity are in flux. Contracts, technological infrastructure, and platform alignments have created a system that cannot be easily rewound. Even if the league wished to restore universal access, the momentum of change, structural, contractual, and technological makes it effectively impossible. What has been lost? The seamlessness of shared ritual. Intergenerational continuity and unconditional loyalty cannot be fully recovered. The landscape is permanently altered, and the consequences are enduring. Yet the situation is not purely deterministic. Fans, leagues, and platforms can adapt, mitigating some of the most alienating aspects of this transformation. Rituals can be preserved, communal participation can be facilitated, and emotional investment can be nurtured even within a transactional framework. However, any adaptation must acknowledge the permanence of structural and cultural shifts already in place. The system has changed irrevocably, and the strategies for preservation or mitigation must operate within the boundaries created by previous decisions. The past cannot be recovered. The future must be managed with care, awareness, and humility. The tension that emerges is unresolved and persistent. Progress, measured in technological sophistication, revenue growth, and global reach, comes at the cost of communal cohesion, ritual continuity, and intergenerational loyalty. Fans remain devoted, yet their engagement is more fragile, more conditional, and more mediated than ever before. Emotional attachment exists, but it is interwoven with structural and transactional constraints. Rituals are reconstructed in fragmented forms, and continuity is contingent upon compliance with a system that was designed for monetization and leverage rather than purely for devotion. The cost of progress is clear, tangible, and enduring. That silence is layered, dense with both presence and absence, celebration and loss. The silence is at once comforting, dissonant, and unsettling measure of what has changed and what may never return. Ritual, habit, and intergenerational continuity have been disrupted. The silence after the game is no longer simply an interval. It is a reflection of all that has been lost and all that remains at risk. It is the quiet aftermath of choices that cannot be undone, and the tension of a future defined by irreversible change. The documentary leaves its viewers with this unresolved truth. Growth and innovation carry consequence. Loyalty is conditional, and cultural cohesion is fragile. The cost of progress is not abstract. It is lived by fans, experienced in silence and embedded in the fragmented rhythms of engagement. What has been gained is visible, measurable, and impressive. What has been lost is subtle, systemic, and deeply cultural. The tension remains unresolved and unavoidable, leaving fans, the league, and the culture to navigate a future shaped by both progress and irrevocable change. The story concludes not with closure, but with reflection. The fans' experience is forever altered, the rituals reconstructed, and the heartbeat of communal fandom fragmented. Progress has been made, yet at a cost that will echo across generations. The silence after the game is the final witness to this transformation. It's an enduring testament to the price of innovation, expansion, and conditional engagement.